My name is Gabriel Melendez, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico. I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Series, a partnership between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about New Mexico, the Greater Southwest as a region, and its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula. The La Canoa Legacy Series takes its inspiration from the word canoa. A canoa is a sloop-rigged fishing boat, common in the Amazon, but in New Mexico it is the name of some common everyday tools, a simple canal or flute, or the wooden paddle a baker uses to move loaves of bread in and out of a hot oven. Always La Canoa receives and transports people and resources. And we want these talks to transport us and move the conversation between presenters and audience members back and forth in rich dialogue. We also want our talks to bring practical, useful information to community members, researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, politics, sociology, and religious experiences of our region.
Before I begin my talk, I'd like to express my gratitude to the many people who have contributed to this project. I would like to acknowledge that I stand here today on the traditional homelands of the Tigua, and I present this work with respect to all the indigenous people who are the traditional guardians of this land and the enduring relationships that exist between indigenous peoples and their traditional territories for many generations in the past, in the present, and into the future. I would also like to thank my family, my friends, and advisors for their support during the process of researching this project and writing my dissertation. In particular, I would like to thank Ramon Gutierrez at the University of Chicago, whose guidance and constructive criticism has been critical to the development of my research and writing. I would also like to thank Gabriel Melendez, the director of the Center for Regional Studies, for the support I've received as a visiting scholar at the University of New Mexico. And finally, I would like to thank the Center for Southwest Research, which is where I've done a lot of the work for this project over the past couple of months in terms of transforming what was a dissertation into journal articles and further down the line into an academic monograph or an overpriced book for libraries and universities and colleges. So my book manuscript, Mapping the Apachería, American Indian Sovereignty and State Power in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, examines one of the more sustained interactions between European and Native empires in North America. This work traces the history of Spanish, Mexican, and U.S. relations with the Apache, or Inde people, in the geographical expanse known as the Apachería. This was a vast region that spanned the present-day states of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and the United States, as well as the Mexican states of Sonora, Chihuahua, and Coahuila. As distant relatives of the people who migrated from Western Canada to the Colorado Plateau and the Central Plains in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Inde were relative newcomers to the dominion claimed by Spain in 1598 as the Kingdom of New Mexico. The dispersed tribal units and bands and clans developed an extensive trading network, connecting the hunters and gatherers of the plains with the primarily horticultural societies of the upper Rio Grande Valley. When Spanish efforts to colonize the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico faltered in the 17th century, the Inde came to occupy an increasingly prominent position on the periphery of colonial society. As a result, Spanish officials implemented a series of new policies intended to reduce their mobility, as well as that of other nomadic populations in the frontiers of New Spain. The Bourbon regime under King Charles III, who was the monarch in Spain between 1759 and 1788, attempted to imply enlightened principles of scientific organization to restrict their movement by placing them on early reservations. So this research will contribute, I hope, to the growing body of interdisciplinary scholarship on the history of indigenous and mixed-race people living in the region known today as the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Previous generations of scholars construed the so-called Spanish borderlands as small, isolated patches of territory in North America that were nominally under the jurisdiction of the Spanish monarchy. While there are notable exceptions, the old school of Spanish borderland studies minimize the role of indigenous and mixed-race populations, casting European colonists as the central protagonist in heroic and celebratory narratives of exploration, conquest, and nation building. Recent research on the region has shifted the analytical focus and expanded the geographical and temporal scope to include a wider cast of actors. So this work is building on the insights of scholars such as Matthew Babcock, Juliana Barr, Jennifer Danette Dale, Margot Tamez, Veronica Velarde Tiller, and Cuauhtemoc Velasco Avila. I seek to show through my research in Spain, in Mexico, and Spanish, Mexican, and U.S. archives, how the Apache became entangled in conflicts over territory, property, and citizenship that divided communities locally and internationally. So, here we have a map that should be familiar to most contemporary observers looking at the American Southwest, and where we have a clear delineation of state boundaries between New Mexico and Arizona, Utah and Colorado, and then Texas, the Panhandle, Oklahoma, and Kansas up to the northeast. This map also indicates the ancestral homelands of the Apache groups in New Mexico that are federally recognized in our modern era. This includes the Jicarilla in northeastern New Mexico, the Athapaskan-speaking Navajo in the northwest, and the Western Apache in Arizona, and the Chiricahua Apache in the New Mexico Boot Heel. You also see the Mescalero Apache, whose ancestral homelands straddled the New Mexico-Texas border, as well as well into Chihuahua and Coahuila, a region that was known during the colonial period as Nueva Vizcaya. So archaeological, linguistic, and oral evidence has established a relationship between the northern Athapaskan, the Athapascans of the Pacific Coast, and the southern Athapaskan-speaking groups, which include the Navajo and the Apache. So the Athapaskan groups were united in west central Canada until approximately 1300 AD, and for reasons unknown began to disperse at that time. Some groups remained in Canada, others migrated to Alaska, and still others began to move south and eventually settled along the Pacific coast and in the southwestern United States. Today there are several subgroups of the Athapaskan language group, which include 23 Athapaskan languages in western Canada and interior Alaska, 8 Pacific Coast related languages, the Navajo language, and 6 Apache languages here in the Southwest. The Apache languages are divided into 2 major groups, the Kiowa Apache and Southwestern Apache. This latter group has been further divided into 2 subgroups, the Jicarilla and the Lipan form one subgroup, and the Mescalero, Chiricahua, and the Western Apache form another. So I bring this into focus because a lot of what we know about this broader pattern of migration and territorial expansion was discovered first by linguists working in the 1970s, who began to put together a bigger picture of how people speaking a very similar language ended up distributed across a very wide area of North America. As I said, from the Pacific Northwest, including Alaska, through the Pacific coast of Northern California, all the way down into the Southwest. So, since the Apache were hunters and gatherers, very little archaeological evidence exists which would provide clues to the routes taken in the move south. There are, however, 2 major theories. The first theory suggests that the Apache moved from the west central Canada and took a western route through Colorado or Utah and then down into the Southwest. Evidence for this route, taken from archaeological evidence in these areas, found circular stone structures that had doors facing to the east, a characteristic of Athapaskan structures, and remains of pointed bottom pottery, which is the Navajo style. This area was also similar in terrain to the northern areas inhabited by the Athapaskans. So the first theory is that they moved south through sort of a western corridor. The second theory suggests that using the historical record, that the Carechos, the Teyas, and the Vaqueros, whom the Spanish encountered in this area, were actually Apache. This would suggest that they migrated through the northwest and came down through the central plains. Native American groups borrowed cultural practices from one another as they came into contact, and several of the Apache groups adopted the plains buffalo culture during this early period. So for the sake of being candid, I'm more of an advocate of the second theory, in that much of the research that I've done based on a combination of archaeological studies and oral traditions and archival analysis suggests that these groups actually moved into the Southwest by way of the Great Plains. And I'll explain that a little bit further as I proceed. Although it is difficult to piece together from existing evidence, Apache groups probably arrived in the Southwest between 1400 and 1525 AD, according to linguistic similarities, Apache oral history, and archaeological evidence. It is challenging to piece together the history of this period for several reasons. First, the Apache who were the first first the Spaniards, who were the first non-natives to arrive in the Southwest, used the name Apache generically to designate both Southern Athapascans and unrelated groups. This makes it difficult to determine if the written accounts of this period describe the practices of the Inde or other native peoples. Second, the Southern Athapascan groups were loosely organized into small kinship groups at the time of arrival. These smaller kinship groups allied with one another to form larger groups or bands when a small group could not accomplish its own task, such as times of war or for major hunts or for other sort of collective activities. But there was no sort of larger collective Apache identity in this earlier period. Each smaller group designated itself by its word meaning the people. And this is the English translation of the native term Ende, that the Apache people used to refer to themselves. It means the people. The term Apache was first used to describe several different cultural groups in the Southwest by Juan de Oñate in 1598. The word may have come from the Zuni word for Navajo or the Yavapai word for people. Whatever the case, a collective Apache identity came into focus only at a much later historical period. So the historical process that propelled the southern Athapascan migration into the Southwest was tied with the emergence of what archaeologists have described as the Southern Plains macroeconomy. And I show this picture, which is one of the earliest illustrations that we have of the bison of the plains, because this information came by way of Spanish exploration of southwestern Kansas in the 16th century by Coronado and Oñate. So the buffalo were central to this concept of a macroeconomy in which the eastern frontier pueblos, including those on the other side of the Manzano Mountains, Coray and Abo, were engaged in trade with the Humanos of the La Junta region at the confluence of the Conchos and the Rio Grande, exchanging beans and squash and corn and other agricultural products with people who lived on the plains, who were predominantly hunters and were producing large quantities of meat, were producing hides and skins for the winters, and were also manufacturing tools out of the massive bones that you would find in the bison herds during this proto-historic period. So trade between pueblos at Taos, Picaris, Pecos, Galisteo, and Gran Quivira with traders from farther east flourished during the proto-historic period between 1200 and 1450 AD. However, with the movement of the ancestral Apache onto the southern plains, the environmental, demographic, social, and political conditions changed in the two areas. So their arrival disrupted trade that had existed between the pueblos and ancestral groups in that region. And archaeological research in Kansas has discovered that at this time, just preceding and sort of contemporaneous with Spanish explorations of the plains, the Apaches had established a homeland in an area called the Dismal River Phase in Scott County, Kansas. And I haven't been to the Dismal River Phase, but it sounds pretty bad. However, we have to consider that climate change has considerably changed what we understand to be our present environment. And given the types of records that people are producing from looking at food production tools, looking at the types of structures that people lived in, the types of trade networks that existed, exchanging different items across the Southwest and into the plains and into other regions, we have to imagine that this was a very different economy. This was a very different environment and would have actually been very productive and very fruitful for people who are hunting and living off of these massive animals. So this is one of the earliest maps that we have of what was known as the kingdom and provinces of New Mexico. And you can see the central corridor of the Rio Grande going up into beyond Taos into Quivira, which was sort of a mythical destination for trade that we now understand to be the Wichita settlements of the plains. We also have Teguayo and sort of other names that have really kind of stirred the imaginations of the colonists in terms of thinking about what this place could be as a productive colony. So when the first Spanish explorers entered the scene in the mid-16th century, they were unaware of the large-scale migration of the southern Athapascans from the north. Indeed, it was not until the mid-19th century that anthropologists began to reconstruct the history of their movement. Pedro de Castañeda, the chronicler of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's expedition to Cibola in the Central Plains in 1540 to 1542, provided a concise description of the people called Carechos and Teyas. He noted, quote, "These people follow the buffalo, hunting them and tanning the skins to take the settlements into the winter to sell, since they go there to pass the winter, each company going to those which are nearest, some to the settlements at Cucuye or Pecos, and others toward Quivira or Wichita, and others to the settlements which are situated in the direction of Florida." So just to get a sense of how Spaniards envisioned the geography of North America during this time, the land southeast of Cibola or Wichita was conceived of as Florida. So there was a kind of a compression of space that was happening in terms of the geography. And this, really, I think, changed the way in which people thought about the North, the Llano Estacado, or these other environments or imagined kingdoms that existed beyond the Rocky Mountains. So Castañeda's observations indicated that Carechos and Teyas were integrated within a broad network of settlements, stretching from the Pecos Pueblo in eastern New Mexico to the Wichita villages in Kansas. The Carechos and Teyas that Castañeda observed on the Central Plains in the mid-16th century represented one of the many different Apache settlements, or rancherias, that modern anthropological research has linked to the Athapascan diaspora. And this term rancheria originated in the Spanish and has been adopted into English as a ranch, but it's generally considered a productive environment for the maintenance of animals and the production of agricultural products. And the rancheria was sort of a generic term that the Spaniards would apply to the villages and the settlements of nomadic groups such as the Apache, the Comanche, and other groups who were on the plains at this point in time. So the various shards of pottery and other types of material culture at the site called the Dismal River phase in present-day Kansas reveal the influence of Mandan, Arikara, Pawnee, and Wichita cultures. Pottery recovered from sites farther south bore the markings of the pottery produced at Taos and Picaris. Colonial authorities continue to observe the activities of these and other groups of Apaches living along the edges of the Spanish settlements in New Mexico during the 17th century. This is the time they developed a lexicon of indigenous ethnonyms that identify the different bands or clans with features of the geography they inhabited, or distinct cultural characteristics in the names of prominent leaders. Thus, the Apache inhabitants of the southern plains were known as the Llaneros, and those living near the Gila and the Mimbres watershed were referred to as Geleños or Membreños. In a similar manner, the Jicarillas were first known for the production of small woven baskets, and that's where we get the name Jicarilla, is describing their craft of basket making at that time. And the Mescaleros of the Sacramento Mountains were known for their seasonal gathering of mescal root or agave. And so the Spaniards would see them active in this food gathering process and would label them for their main sort of economic activity, or their job, if you will. Some of the names are more obscure, such as the Ipandis or the Lipan Apaches of Texas, but the Spaniards tended to use this lexicon consistently, and they modified it as their understanding of this indigenous geography changed over time. So in the 17th century, the descendants of the Carechos and Teyas continued to bring bison meat and hides to trade for agricultural resources and crafts at the eastern pueblos. With the establishment of Catholic missions in New Mexico, however, the Southern Plains macroeconomy began to fall apart. A new landscape was created in New Mexico with the Spanish conquest and occupation. Colonial warfare, the spread of infectious diseases, and the introduction of new institutions severely reduced the native population. The labor and tribute system, known as the encomienda, was particularly devastating. The Spanish demand and consumption of the Pueblo's surplus food supplies had severely reduced the availability of corn, squash, and beans. As a result, some groups of the Apache resorted to raiding the Pueblos and the Spanish settlements in order to procure the goods they had once acquired through mutually beneficial trade. Such raids provoked counteroffensives, which were led by Spanish military officers and assisted by auxiliary soldiers from the Pueblos. Spanish expeditions against the Apache were at times merely excuses for certain unscrupulous colonists to acquire captives and to sell them as slaves to work at the silver mines in Nueva Vizcaya. New Mexico Governor Luis de Rosas, who was in charge between 1637 and 1641, for example, opened an obraje, or a sweatshop in Santa Fe, for the production of textiles for export, and the majority of his laborers were captives taken from the plains. As a result of this harsh treatment, some of the Pueblo communities who had suffered the brunt of Spanish conquest and colonization chose to abandon their homes and seek refuge among the Apache. For example, the Pueblos of Taos, Picaris, and Pecos maintained especially strong and durable relations with the Plains and the Jicarilla Apaches throughout the 17th century. In 1739, the people of Taos rose up against the Spanish government and the Franciscan missionaries. After the incident, which was a precursor to the much larger revolt in 1680, the Taoseños fled to the plains. According to Silvestre Vélez de Escalante, they, quote, withdrew to the Buffalo Plains and fortified themselves at a place which afterwards, on this account, was called El Cuartalejo. So El Cuartalejo, along with Quivira and Teguayo, was amongst one of these places on the colonial map of the Southwest that ended up becoming a very important location. And El Cuartalejo was first populated by refugees from the Pueblos who went to go join the Apaches. And they established sort of rudimentary house structures that archaeologists have since excavated and examined. But it existed in the area northeast of New Mexico. And this area began to be explored not only by the Spaniards, but also by the French in the late 17th century, during the time of the reconquest of New Mexico. And so some of the earliest maps that we have of this region and its relationship to Mexico actually come from the French archive. And the French are very active in the Great Lakes region for missionary projects, as well as for hunting, and especially the procurement of beaver and other types of furs that they would sell in Europe by way of the St. Lawrence Seaway. So following the Spanish reconquest of New Mexico between 1692 and 1696, significant numbers of Spaniards and their Pueblo allies returned to the region they had abandoned a decade earlier. The surge in population in the early 18th century once again transformed the cultural landscape of New Mexico, as the people brought thousands of sheep, cattle, and horses, as well as iron and steel tools for cultivating the land. Yet the wealth of commodities the Spaniards carried north from El Paso del Norte arrived at a time of heightened competition for control of trade routes in the territory. While the settlers attempted to establish mines, ranches, and estates in the outlying districts in the early 1700s, they were entangled in regional conflicts that blurred the lines between Spanish and native sovereignty. So the next section of my paper, which is probably much, much longer than I could ever hold a captive audience for, looks at the relationship that formed between the Plains and the Jicarilla Apache during the early 18th century. And this was a very tumultuous period in this region's history because of the competition between the French and the Spanish for control of tribal territories for the Northeast and the economy that was associated with that. So it was in the winter of 1719 that the priest of, the priest who was at the San Jeronimo, the Taos, first began to write letters to the government and to the governor of New Mexico and the viceroy in Mexico City, requesting permission to establish a mission for the Jicarilla Apache. And large numbers of the Jicarilla were moving into Taos and into the Taos Valley, into Picoris and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, fleeing sort of the violence that was emerging on the plains at this point. So given the paucity of water in the region, the severity of the winters, and the lack of building materials, the men in attendance determined that it would be most advantageous to move the various groups of Apache to the valley of La Jicarilla. The governor used their close proximity to the Spanish settlements at Taos, hoping that they would facilitate their religious conversion and help them establish a buffer between the Spanish settlements there and the Utes, the Comanches, the Pawnees, and the other nations allied with the French further to the northeast. So during this period, there were a number of expeditions led by actually pretty considerable numbers of people from New Mexico out to the plains in an attempt to fortify that part of New Mexico at El Cuartelejo. And one of the most famous because of its ill-fated end was the expedition of Pedro de Villasur in 1720. And one of the accounts that we have of this expedition is a hide painting that was discovered in Sonora that was believed to have been located at a Jesuit mission in northern Sonora or Arizona area. And eventually, this hide painting made it back to Santa Fe after being held by, I believe, a Swedish collector in Europe. But it depicts this the expedition led from New Mexico, and you can see the New Mexicans are wearing these felt or leather hats and wielding rather lengthy carbines or rifles, who have been cornered and are completely surrounded by Plains Indians who are in this illustration wielding spears and arrows and have very elaborate sort of body paint. And if you're ever in Santa Fe and can make it to the History Museum, you can actually see both of the paintings in this series. And they're really remarkable sort of portraits of the social composition of New Mexico during this early 18th century period. The significance of this event for the Apache was that the Spaniards decided to abandon their plans to try and colonize this particular area, which is close to the San Luis Valley of southern Colorado, and withdrew much of their resources because 40 of Pedro Villasur's men lost their lives during this tragic event. So the Jicarilla were seeking accommodation with the Spaniards, promising to convert themselves to Catholicism and to settle at missions and to live peacefully in the Taos Valley. But once this event occurred, such accommodation was no longer possible, and there continued to be this sort of tumultuous environment in northern New Mexico. So I'm going to shift focus a little bit now and look at a different culture group who had a related and similar history to that of the Jicarilla in northern New Mexico. And this is the Lipan Apache of Texas. And the Lipan Apache are not nearly as prolific in this early period in terms of the documentation that you could find in the archive. And that has a lot to do with their decision to leave their previous homelands in the Llano Estacado and to seek a different path that brought them through the Pecos and the Colorado rivers of Texas. And so some of the earliest accounts that we have of the Lipan Apache are from San Antonio de Bahar, which was an early outpost for Spanish defense in central Texas. So this is an early map that we have of the Presidio itself. And as you can imagine, or you can see from this map, it had fortifications surrounding it, but it was, for the most part, very isolated and very, very vulnerable out there in sort of the hill country of Texas. So, since the founding of the Presidio of San Antonio de Bahar in 1721, the Lipan Apache defiantly asserted their hegemony in the region, greeting the first wave of settlers by planting a row of arrow shafts with red cloth flying from the tops outside the walls, which was designed to put the Spaniards on notice that they resided along Apache borders. In 1740, the local lieutenant submitted his first official report of frontier conditions at San Antonio. In that report, he described the many logistical difficulties that he faced during a military campaign he conducted against the Lipan Apaches the previous winter. So initially, relations between the Spaniards and the Apaches were not friendly. But that changed. In January and February, Urrutia led several expeditions from the Presidio of San Antonio de Bahar to the northwest in the vicinity of Guadalupe, San Saba, and the Concho River valleys. Collectively, these expeditions proved a total failure. So this lieutenant's name was Toribio de Urrutia, and he said, "The tactics and the strategies that were advanced for the Catholic faith of your Majesty did not have the desired effect. Neither he nor any of the 44 men accompanying him had succeeded in apprehending a single one of their enemies. He acknowledged that they continued to, quote, freely lord over all the territory from here through Coahuila, and they have all the lands for themselves to go wherever they please, to plunder and to kill at their liberty." Urrutia struggled to define a new strategy to control the Lipan Apache, as he did not believe they could simply be terrorized into submission using brute force. Indeed, he was critical of such heavy-handed tactics because, in his opinion, they have given this proud nation of Indians who infest this land the occasion and reason to murder, rob, and so forth. So in a sort of similar dynamic as what took place in northern New Mexico during this period, the people of San Antonio de Bahar in Texas attempted to establish missions. And these missions would provide places that the Lipan Apache could seek refuge from their enemies in the plains, but they also provided a very significant source of labor within the colony itself. So this is all based on a single document that Urrutia submitted to the central government in this year 1740. So the lieutenant revealed in his report that at the 5 missions in his jurisdiction, the priests had resorted to coercion in order to maintain the steady supply of manual labor that the missions required. He noted the devastation brought by the smallpox epidemic, observing that many had died and those who had not deserted the missions for fear of sickness. In response to this problem, on various occasions the priests had gone with several soldiers into the hills in search of the fugitives, whom they apprehended and brought back to the missions. He adamantly denied that the Lipan Apaches who settled in the missions were forced to work against their will. Rather, he said the missionaries employ the Indians only in a very moderate labor, as there are people who are not familiar with work. They treat all of them with the greatest love and care, hence obtaining their affection for this mode of living and their successful conversion. Yet he acknowledged the missions, as well as the secular settlements, would fall apart without the labor of the Indians. He wrote, "As they are experiencing this work and spend much of the year tending to their crops, acequias, and dams. As a result, the construction of the church goes little by little." He noted the village of San Fernando, for example, desperately needed improvement of its church and other public works. Moreover, the crops had failed that year, leading Urrutia to state it will be inexcusable to buy corn from the Indians of the mission for the maintenance of the presidios. His report revealed an ironic situation. It depicted the Lipan Apaches as being integral to the operation of the missions, the cultivation of crops, and the building of the physical and social structures that constituted the early Texas colonies. But it also represented the same people as the greatest peril to the peace and the stability of the frontier settlements. So there's a famous painting that's located at the Castillo de Chapultepec in Mexico City that looks at one of the attempts to establish a mission in Texas. And this is a depiction from the year 1758. I don't know exactly when it was produced, but it's depicting an event from 1758 that occurred at the mission of San Saba. And the San Saba River Valley had been a location where the Lipan Apache had settled for many years, and where the Franciscans thought it would be a good idea to establish a mission. And at a certain point, the tumultuous nature of the conflicts happening on the Great Plains kind of bled into the colony itself. So this new mission was described as a sturdy structure with a log stockade surrounding it with only one gate as an entry, secured with iron bars and buildings that cut into the outer wall with loopholes through which defenders could shoot guns or arrows. However, after it was completed, the mission remained empty for several weeks. Even when the friars were able to coax a number of families to settle at the missions, they remained on the edge and fearful of Comanche attacks. Such fears proved well-founded in late February, when a large group of Comanche and Wichita warriors stampeded the horse herd at the nearby Presidio. In the subsequent attack on the Spanish complex, an estimated 2,000 Comanche, Wichita, and allied Plains Indians pillaged the mission stores and herds, burning mission buildings to the ground, and killed Spaniards. So this painting was obviously produced to celebrate the martyrdom of the two Franciscans who lost their lives during this event. But I think it's an important historical document for understanding this other dynamic that was sort of happening in the background to sort of the colonial program itself. So this painting of the destruction of San Saba mission by the Spanish painter José de Páez vividly illustrated the fate of the two Franciscans. Alonso Geraldo de Terreros on the left and José Santa Esteban on the right are depicted as martyrs whose gory wounds are testaments to their religious faith and their service to the crown. While such representations of Franciscan martyrdom were relatively common in the period, this painting is especially noteworthy for its remarkable attention to detail, including the wooden stockades surrounding the missions and the leather armor adorning the aggressors' horses. Moreover, this painting demonstrated the considerable effort of both Spaniards and Lipan Apaches to find accommodation in Texas in the mid-18th century. So, the Jicarilla in New Mexico and the Lipan in Texas, at this early point, really did make an effort to find diplomatic alliances with the Spaniards. And we can see through these two artworks, the Segreser hide painting and this depiction of the San Saba massacre in 1758, that that plan was foiled by the conflict that was happening in the plains due to competition for resources. And the next section that I'm going to look at changes focus again to look at a different group that was further south in the region known as Nueva Vizcaya. And Nueva Vizcaya actually encompassed parts of present-day Chihuahua as well as Durango. It actually went all the way down to the coast, close to where Sinaloa is. So it was a very large, sprawling jurisdiction. But the Mescalero Apache of New Mexico had a very outsized influence in its history during the 18th century. And I'm going to plug in my computer so that I still have some battery power for this last two sections of my talk, and then I will tell you a little bit about the Mescaleros. So I'm actually going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over this section and talk about the final part of my presentation for today and my conclusion, and then we'll have time for any Q&A that people may have. So while they established political control over large swaths of territory in northern New Spain, the Apaches' position in the periphery also made them vulnerable to attacks by other native people and to colonists. In the ongoing warfare between Apache, Navajo, Comanche, Ute, and Plains Indians, it was common for women and children to be taken as captives. According to the law of the Indies, colonial authorities were required to release or ransom such captives in a practice known as rescate. The captive women and men who were taken into Spanish households to work as domestic servants and slaves were identified in the colonial records as criados, from the Spanish verb criar, to raise, and janitzeros, which is derived from an archaic Turkish term for janissary. While the term criado has connotations with paternalism, many of the captives who entered the Spanish colonial society in this manner were subjected to physical abuse and sexual exploitation at the hands of their masters. There are a tragic number of court cases and legal documents from the Spanish archives of New Mexico that reveal the dehumanizing and degrading conditions with which they were treated. As many scholars have shown, the practice of buying and selling servants and slaves was widespread in the colonial period. Indeed, some scholars have estimated the number of criados and janitzeros in colonial area New Mexico constituted as much as 1/3 of the total population. While these detribalized peoples were taken from different regions across the northern frontier, the majority of the baptismal records indicate their place of origin as the Apachería. Given their precarious position in the periphery and the plurality of enemies, it should not be surprising that some bands of Apaches chose peace rather than war. The so-called Apaches the Paz, or Apaches of Peace, represented the groups who opted to receive rations and gifts rather than risk being killed, captured, or enslaved by the Spanish troops or their native allies. In 1786, the Viceroy of New Spain, Bernardo de Galvez, introduced a new policy that offered material benefits and security to Apaches who elected to settle at places such as Sabanal, which is at the confluence of the Puerco and Rio Grande rivers south of Albuquerque. And this particular document from the Spanish archives in New Mexico is actually an account ledger that looks at the expenses associated with supplying the Apaches the Paz with rations, which would have been everything from corn to beans to clothing and even horses and work animals. So the population of the Apaches the Paz reached a peak in 1793 when more than 10,000 Apaches settled on reservations in the borderlands of New Mexico, Sonora, Nueva Vizcaya, Coahuila, and Texas. The new policy did not bring an end to colonial violence, but the peace settlements continued to supply rations to the Apaches the Paz through the end of the colonial period and during their first decades of Mexican independence. However, historical records show that once the government of Mexico suspended rations in 1833, the frequency and the intensity of the raids quickly accelerated. So this peace program was adopted by Mexico after Spain's independence in 1821, but it proved much too expensive for the nation to sustain. And this is one of the reasons why there's an upsurge in raiding during the 1830s and 1840s here in this region, is because this program fell apart. So in conclusion, the Spanish archives of New Mexico offer a window into a world that was defined by changing environmental, demographic, social, and political forces. Combined with archaeological research, it is possible to reconstruct the history of southern Athapaskan migration and territorial expansion. So as I have outlined here, between 1350 and 1500 AD, the ancestral Apache moved from the Pacific Northwest through the southern plains and the Colorado Plateau and into the region claimed by Spain as the Kingdom of New Mexico. This was a complex process involving many different stages of development. Oral history and literature can provide a more complete understanding of the cultural and intellectual traditions that Native peoples developed to explain these events. This is particularly true with regard to religious beliefs, kinship networks, and techniques for gathering food that the ancestral Apache adopted when they participated in the Southern Plains macroeconomy. The chronicles of exploration and conquest written during the early stages of contact also offer a view of the forces shaping life in the region during the mid-16th and 17th century. Colonial records from the early 18th century documented the efforts of the Jicaría and the Lipanes to find accommodation of the Franciscan missions near Taos in northern New Mexico and in San Antonio in Texas. Farther south in present-day Chihuahua, the Mescalero Apache extended their range of trading and raiding networks in the mid-18th century, much to the displeasure of local authorities. The Mescaleros were crucial to the distribution of horses, mules, sheep, and other livestock during this period. Moreover, they transformed the political geography of the region by absorbing other indigenous and non-indigenous groups into multi-ethnic raiding bands. Over the course of many years and generations, what was often regarded as sporadic and unrelated episodes of frontier violence can be understood as part of a larger historical process involving human migration, intersocietal conflict, and indigenous imperialism. By examining this historical process through a critical reading of the archival materials, it is possible to bring into focus the contours of state power and to better understand Native American cultural traditions and political systems that transcend the political or the geographical boundaries of colonial New Mexico. So thank you very much.
Today, do the Apaches still have a reservation in this state?
Yeah, there are, the Mescalero have a reservation in the Sacramento Mountains in Otero County, and the Jicarilla have a reservation at Dulce, which I believe is in Rio Arriba County, but it might be San Juan County, I'm not sure. And there are a number of reservations also in Arizona, including the San Carlos, the White Mountain, and the Tonto. The Lipan Apache have developed a reservation in southern Texas, but that is sort of a contested status because traditionally the state of Texas has been reluctant to acknowledge sort of federal status within the state. So that's a different story. The Chiricahua Apache, who were removed from their homeland in the late 19th century and sent as prisoners of war to Florida and then on to Oklahoma, have also been petitioning New Mexico for a reservation in southwestern New Mexico in the Boot Heel. But that has not been approved because of debates about federal status also.
Somebody else?
How can you make a distinction between the Navajo and everything you've told us about the Apache? Because weren't they, in a sense, doing the same thing at the same time?
So I consider them to be very different histories in the sense that in the 17th century, even preceding the Pueblo Revolt, the Navajo, or the Dene, had extensive relations with the Quechua-speaking Pueblos, including Jemez and Acoma. And the cultural exchange that was happening at that time transformed sort of what might be considered an Apache culture or an Athapaskan culture into a Dene culture, which is more of a hybrid or syncretic identity. And so as a result of that cultural exchange that was happening, there was a production of sort of a new native nation that is in many ways separate from the Apache that we see in other parts of North America. You can see that also in terms of the language. If you look at the Apache nouns for specific words for horse or for water or for mountain, you will see similarities between Dene and Nde as Athapaskan languages, but it's actually a different dialect. You know, it's a different way of speaking about a similar concept. Yes.
And you talk about the role of the Comanches. I understand that they were pushing the Apaches out of the southern plains.
Sure. The Comanche, the Numanu, were Shoshones, and so they had moved out of the Great Basin into the southern plains at a later period, and they emerged at a time when equestrian culture and horses were becoming very important for the plains, and they mastered that art of herding and of riding and of raiding. And in a sense, they applied that technology in a much more agile way than the Apaches did because they were newcomers, and they were able to use the new tool of the horse to very rapidly expand their influence and their power. But historically, if you look at their arrival to the Great Plains, they came to that region at least a full 100 years after the Apache had already established themselves there. Yeah.
The Apaches went all the way down into Chihuahua. I was just wondering why they didn't stay.
Well, I think there are reasons to understand that they did stay. A colleague of mine at the University of New Mexico, Enrique La Madrid, recently sent me a picture of a statue of Victorio, who's a major figure in 19th century Mescalero Apache history. And they have a statue of Victorio in the central plaza in the city of Chihuahua. And he's recognized as an icon, as a hero. And so I think that if there are historians working in that region, there would probably be many people who would be able to trace their history back to an Athapaskan culture.
Yeah, that's one of the other thing with it, fresh in my mind, they would take over entire haciendas and hold them hostage until they got paid. So they'd hold the whole community there. So there had to be some exchange there. And just a question why you wouldn't have a larger presence.
Well, I'm not an expert on Chihuahua or Nueva Vizcaya, but the histories that I have read said that there were a lot of alliances that were formed between the Apache and the Tarahumara, for example. The Tarahumara ended up being called Apaches. This term is sort of a blanket epithet in many ways. And so those people who are identified as Apaches might be Spaniards. They might be castas. They might have some other sort of cultural background. But Apache became a way of describing the people who were raiding the haciendas, the people who were committing crimes. And so what I'm hoping to disentangle through this research is sort of that history of migration and that history of movement that's separate from sort of a Hollywood stereotype that emerges at a later point in time. Yes?
I was actually talking to somebody from Pico East, and we were talking about feast days, and I was very aware of the connection in Pico East with the Higaria. And he was mentioning that during some feast days, they do dances in honor of the Kiowa. And when they fled Pico East to be with the Apaches. So what was that connection, particularly up in the Sangre de Cristo, where you have the, Higaria, you have the Ute, you have the Pawnee, you have the Kiowas, and the Apaches. How were, these groups all dealt with each other? In parts you have, El Valle de los Comanches, El Valle de los, whatever. So you had all these groups, these bands. So what was this connection?
So I think it was part of this exchange for food, for crafts. The production of micaceous pottery at Picoris is something that was taken out to the plains, and you'll find examples of Picoris style pottery, at these sites in the Texas Panhandle or in Kansas, which suggests that it may have been women who had mastered this craft and through kinship relations ended up becoming residents of an Apache rancheria. And during the revolt period, as early as in the 1730s, the Taos and the Picoris pueblos were leaving and joining the Apaches as renegades, as refugees.
And that was in Kansas? Where did they go? I mean, that was kind of like, for me, really interesting, because I was talking to somebody and they were, talking about the connection with the Apaches in Kansas and that whole trading. So, when they fled, did they go to Kansas or where was it that they fled to?
Well, I've looked at a lot of these early maps, and the archaeologists I think have the best explanation, because they're actually digging into the ground and saying people lived here for many years, and here's what they were doing. And those sites are the Garza complex is in by the Texas Panhandle. There's another complex out there called Giada Blanca, where there's heavy evidence of exchange between the Athapaskans and the Pueblos in northern New Mexico that had preceded colonization for many years.
And I guess also because there are the stories of, even afterwards in the ciboleros, and where they would take their buffalo hides and they would take them to Kansas. So there just seems to be this kind of connection with the Apachería and Kansas. And is that like in your book, or it's just something to read? I just found it interesting as I talked to people from different,
Yeah, I think in the sort of the collective memory of folk tales and mythologies and stories that people tell, the Comanches have a very outsized sort of presence. A lot of the songs that people sing or the artwork that people have is about the Comanches. But what I'm trying to do through this project is recover the fact that preceding the Apaches were a separate culture group that had a very wide-ranging influence. And what happened in northern New Mexico is similar to what happened in Texas and similar to what happened in Chihuahua and similar to what happened in Sonora. And that's part of a sort of a broader narrative that's related but not directly related to the Comancheria. Other questions? Okay.
I read a little bit about the amount of what was recorded as exporting of nomadic Apaches to the other colonial territories in the Caribbean, right? And I remember reading there was maybe a dozen-year period where up to 40 to 50,000 indigenous people were exported to like the island of Barbados at one time for agricultural reasons before they brought in the African slaves. And I'm not sure if you found any of that in your research or can speak any more to that, of what you might have read in terms of better understanding if they were just called Apaches, if they were some of the intermingling within the different indigenous people of that area that you're referring to, and if you've read any more about that exporting. From what I understand, Santa Fe was known as the second slave trade capital of the New World because of all that exporting of the indigenous and the Apache.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I mentioned the peace policy that emerged in the late 18th century. And this was an attempt to settle people at early reservations in the Southwest. But the flip side of that was the war that continued. And the war was very violent. And as a result of that, there were many prisoners who were taken out of the Southwest. And as you say, they were taken in convoys down to Mexico City and out to Veracruz, and they were used as manual labor in places like Cuba. There's a historian named Paul Conrad who's written pretty extensively about that phenomenon. It's a deportation policy of taking people out of their homelands and moving them away to work as slaves, as laborers in the Caribbean. So I would recommend looking at Paul Conrad's work, and Matthew Babcock has also written about that.
Yeah, I was just saying, I was just going to point out that this confluence of indigenous communities in different areas and the introduction of the Apache and the interactions with the Comanche and the Athapaskan in the San Antonio region has a long history of people's interacting with a major trading post for indigenous, particularly Athapaskan peoples, because they were just not one. Arrangements, but they share that language groups. And so it's hard to sort of know whether the documents, because as you suggested, the archival words were kind of fuzzy. So everybody became Apache, no matter sort of what they belonged to, or they became, depending on which mission you were in, you were doing other things. But I think it's important to remember sort of the interactions of also with the Europeans, which came first with the military and then the church and then civil, and their interactions in that mix as well. Because that's, I think, a really interesting part of the story.
Yeah, fortunately, the San Antonio archives have been digitized, and so for looking at that particular region, you had to go to this really terrible microfilm for years and years. But they've digitized a lot of these records, and now you can do keyword searches for native tribal groups, and they proliferate throughout the 18th century archive. And you can, the Cojuteltecans is one. I remember seeing there was a there was a missionary who studied the language extensively and had translated, some of the liturgy into Cojuteltecan, the language, which preserved the language itself. So I think the archival record really reveals the diversity of that period in Southwestern history and more broadly American history.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Anybody want to add anything? No? Bueno, okay, thank you for such a
All right,
really
thank
good
you.
talk.
Thank you all.